My name is Lin Poyer. I'm a professor of anthropology at the University of Wyoming, and I have been invited by Professor Tung of the anthropology department here at National Taiwan University to speak about Micronesia and World War II. My research is in the islands of Micronesia, and those people who live in Micronesia today are somehow related in the distant past to the Aborigines of Taiwan. So there's a continuing interest in the connection between Taiwan and Micronesia. My work most recently has been on what happened to the Micronesians during the Pacific War, the time of the Japanese Empire and after that. The entire area of Micronesia was held by Japan under a League of Nations mandate starting in except for Guam, which was an American possession, starting after World War I. So when the Pacific War began, most of the islands of Micronesia were part of the Japanese Empire. And in fact, some of the first attacks of the war were mounted from the islands of Micronesia. So then, as the tide of war turned and the war came through the islands, the American and also British troops fought through the islands of Micronesia towards Japan. So those islands suffered a great deal, either from invasion or from being bombed by Americans in the course of the war, or from being used by the Japanese for labor or for fortification. So almost all the islands were affected by the war in one way or another. In fact, I first became interested in the subject when I worked on the island of Tarawa in Maloelap Atoll in the Marshall Islands, because they were wondering if it would make a good historical park. It is the best preserved World War II era airbase in the world, because after it was abandoned at the end of the war, it was never completely cleaned up. So you can go there now and find shells on the beach and old fortifications and guns rusted over, and it's a little piece of history right there. So throughout the islands you see the physical remains, you see the destruction of the war where, for example, bombing ruined people's taro gardens or hurt part of the reefs. And you also see the result of the war in people's lives, people who lost relatives or people who lost connections with their Japanese or Okinawan families after the war. Before the war, Micronesia was part of the Japanese Empire, and so people were kind of on their way to becoming Japanese in that style, and people in Taiwan had the same experience. After the war, the situation was very confused for a long time because the United States didn't want to own these islands, and yet they couldn't sustain themselves economically. So until the islands became independent nations a couple of decades ago, it was not at all clear what their future would be. But I think in the past 2 decades we've really seen these young nations take strong action to set their own goals and to say, as you said, to be culturally autonomous, to go along with their political autonomy, and to keep working on the economic autonomy. It depends on what generation you talk to. The older people remember the good things about the Japanese era. They remember the cheap imports. They remember that everybody was employed. They remember that they had things like nice towns and newspapers and good shipping service. And those things were all lost after the war for 20 or 30 years. When I talk to the young people, they just remember the stories of the bombing, the stories of the harsh Japanese military rule, the starvation, the difficulties. So it's very interesting that they see that the 2 generations see the Japanese era differently. The younger generation sees the American era as a time of freedom and opportunity and more education, the older generation sees the American era as a time of too much freedom for young people and not enough discipline and strong, what shall we say, strong community laws. So the two generations have very different views, I think. Memories of war is so interesting because different cultures remember things in different ways. In the United States, we remember the war through memorials. We have official memorials and monuments to those who died in the war or served in the war. We have a lot of books written about the war. And I think that's also true in other parts of the world. In Micronesia, people do not tend to build monuments about the war, and they don't tend to write books about the war, but they do have songs and dances that commemorate the war, and they have oral traditions, oral histories that remember the war. So when I talk to people, the younger people, what do they know about the war? They don't know it directly, but they know the stories they've heard, or they've seen a dance that's about the war, and that's how the memories continue. And that's why one of the most important things that island peoples do is they translate their oral histories into songs, into chants, and into dance. And that way it won't get lost because people love the art form. So even though they might not know exactly what the story is about in a historic sense, they know the poetry and they know the movements. So it remains important to them. It's harder in the urban areas of Micronesia, where the younger people tend to travel to Honolulu or Guam to go to college, and so they aren't home as much with the older people. But on the other hand, what I found is the younger generations are more literate and are more interested in writing down the memories. So I met many young people who were already writing their grandparents' memories themselves, or they were tape recording, or they were filming. So I don't feel that those memories will be lost, but I do feel that everywhere in the world we're losing that World War II generation. And so I urge all young people to try to talk to their grandparents and get those memories everywhere, because the entire world was affected by that war. So I know here in Taiwan, people had an experience of the Japanese Empire that's distinctive and special to Taiwan, and I hope those memories are collected and remembered for the future. Because Micronesians were not the combating powers in the war, they were not people who made decisions, they were not the actual generals or admirals fighting the war, they were the people that the Americans and British and the Japanese were fighting on their land, but the Micronesians had no control over the fight. Because of this, they really see themselves, I think, as people who have a message of peace, because they felt powerless during the war, and even after the war, you know, the nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands happened. The bomb that fell on Hiroshima was launched from a Micronesian island. So they feel very strongly that in the future they want to make their land a land of peace, and they want to speak out to the public about the danger of war. So when I talk to older people, the last question I ask them is, what do you want to tell younger generations about the war? And always they said, we want to tell them it's important to remember how horrible it is, so that we bring it to an end.